A racist, Karen fills a black man's pool with cement, thinking she can intimidate him. But when she discovers he's the new police chief, her world turns upside down, and the moment she realizes who he is will leave you in awe. Don't miss this jaw-dropping moment of justice. The early morning sun bathed the suburban neighborhood in a golden glow, casting long shadows over freshly manicured lawns. The rhythmic hiss of sprinklers filled the air, and birds chirped in the towering oak trees. It was the kind of morning that exuded peace, the kind where nothing should feel out of place. But something was. Derek Lawson stepped onto his back patio, dressed in his usual morning routine: sweatpants, a faded t-shirt, and running shoes. He was ready to start the day with a quick lap around the neighborhood before heading to his first full day at work. He took a deep breath, enjoying the crispness of the morning air, then turned toward his backyard oasis, and froze. His heart slammed against his ribs. His brand new swimming pool, just finished last week, the one he had been planning for years, the one his daughter had been counting down the days to dive into, was now nothing more than a solid slab of cement. The bright blue water, the smooth tiles, the gentle ripple of morning light dancing on the surface, all gone. In its place, thick grey concrete filled the entire pool, hardened under the sun like a cruel joke. Derek's breath came sharp and uneven. His hands trembled as he took a slow step forward, then another. He dropped to one knee and reached out, pressing his fingertips against the surface. Ice cold, unforgiving. His mind raced, trying to make sense of what he was seeing. Who could have done this, and why? A soft crunch of footsteps on grass made his blood turn to ice. Then, a chuckle, low, smug, and unmistakably familiar. Derek slowly turned his head toward the wooden fence separating his yard from the house next door. Standing there, arms crossed and a twisted smirk plastered across her face, was Karen Whitmore. Karen, the woman who had made it her personal mission to remind Derek and his family that they did not belong in this neighborhood. Karen, who had called the HOA on him 5 times in the last 2 weeks alone. Karen, whose eyes burned with the same venomous entitlement she carried like a second skin. She cocked her head to the side, watching him with something disturbingly close to satisfaction. "Oh dear," she said, her voice dripping with mock concern. "Looks like someone ruined your little oasis." Derek clenched his jaw. His grip on control was razor-thin, his fists tight at his sides. "Do not react. Stay calm." Karen let out a laugh, her sharp red nails tapping lazily against the fence post. "Shame, really," she continued, her voice lilting with fake sympathy. "I mean, pools can be such a waste when they're not meant for the right kind of people, you know." Derek inhaled deeply through his nose. He could hear his heart pounding in his ears, feel the slow, dangerous burn rising in his chest. He had faced men with weapons drawn, had walked into gang hideouts without flinching, had been in life-or-death situations more times than he cared to count. But somehow, this cut deeper than anything. Karen smirked, seemingly emboldened by his silence. She waved a hand dismissively. "Maybe next time you'll think twice before moving somewhere you clearly do not fit in." Derek stared at her, his expression unreadable. He could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on him, an old anger bubbling just beneath the surface. But he did not let it show. Instead, he slowly stood, dusting off his hands as he took one last look at the ruined pool. He turned back to Karen, eyes dark and steady. She did not know one thing. Derek Lawson was the new chief of police, and justice was coming. Derek Lawson had spent his entire life working twice as hard to prove himself in a world that constantly tried to tell him where he did and did not belong. So when he received the promotion that made him the first black police chief in the town's history, it was more than just a title. It was a statement. It was a promise to his wife, Aisha, and their 10-year-old daughter, Zoe, that they would finally have the life they had dreamed of. A life where their home was a sanctuary, where they could enjoy summer nights on the porch without fear, where their daughter could grow up without constantly feeling like an outsider. But from the moment they moved in 3 weeks ago, it had been clear that not everyone felt the same way. And at the center of it all was Karen Whitmore. At first, it was the passive-aggressive comments disguised as concern. "Oh, you must be the new help. The Johnsons moved out so fast I did not think the house was sold yet." When Derek introduced himself as the new homeowner, her smile tightened, but she quickly recovered. "Well, welcome. I just hope you understand how we do things around here." Then came the HOA complaints. She reported them for having the wrong shade of blue on their front door, for leaving their trash bins out 10 minutes past collection time, for Zoe drawing with sidewalk chalk on their own driveway. And every time, Derek handled it with professionalism and restraint. He had seen worse. He had dealt with worse. He was not going to let a bitter woman ruin this for his family. But Karen did not stop. One evening, just before sunset, Derek was outside watering the lawn when Karen stormed onto his property. "How exactly did you afford this house?" she demanded, arms crossed. Derek blinked, caught off guard by the directness of her attack. "Excuse me?" Karen scoffed, gesturing to his home. "Houses in this neighborhood start at 7 figures, and I just find it interesting that you—" She motioned up and down at him. "Managed to end up here." Derek inhaled slowly, gripping the garden hose in his hand. "I worked for it," he said calmly, "like everyone else here." Karen's eyes narrowed. "We do not need people like you here," she muttered under her breath, before turning sharply on her heel and marching back to her house. Derek watched her go, his jaw tight. He had dealt with racists before. He had heard those words before. But hearing them here, in his own neighborhood, in the place that was supposed to be his family's refuge, it hit different. And the worst part? Karen was just getting started. Derek stood in his ruined backyard, the cement-filled pool a cold, grey reminder of how far some people would go to maintain their illusion of control. His hands curled into fists at his sides. This was not just vandalism. This was an attack, a message meant to intimidate, humiliate, and drive him out. But Karen had made a mistake. She thought she had targeted just another black man who could be bullied into submission. She had no idea who she was up against. Derek wasted no time. He changed into his uniform, clipped his badge onto his belt, and drove straight to the local precinct. He knew most of the officers there only by name. Some had likely heard of his appointment as the new chief of police, but few had met him yet. He wanted to see how they handled this situation, without knowing who he was. At the front desk, he filed the report. The young officer taking notes furrowed his brow when he heard the name of the suspect. "Karen Whitmore?" he repeated, glancing at his partner. A shift in the air. A silent exchange. Derek caught it immediately. "You know her?" he asked, his voice measured. The officer cleared his throat. Well, yeah. Her husband's a big shot. Maya plays golf with him every weekend. And, Karen's, well, she's been here a few times." "For what?" The officer hesitated. "HOA disputes, harassment claims, but nothing ever sticks. People just let it go." Derek arched a brow. "Let it go." "She's well connected," another officer chimed in, not looking up from his desk. "Most people do not want the trouble." Derek clenched his jaw. He could feel it, the way they were stalling, reluctant to act against one of their own. "I see," Derek said coolly. "Well, I would like to see the security footage from my street." The officer hesitated. "Sir, are you sure you want to push this?" Derek smiled, but there was no warmth in it. "I am sure." That night, Derek sat in his home office, laptop open, eyes locked on the security footage from his street cameras. He fast-forwarded through the previous night, watching shadows stretch across his property under the glow of streetlights. And then, movement. He pressed play. A construction crew, arriving just past midnight. A cement mixer backing into his driveway. And then, Karen. standing with her arms crossed, giving orders like she owned the place. Derek leaned forward, his blood simmering with fury. Karen had hired them. She had lied, claiming the pool was part of her property, directing the workers with absolute confidence. And then, she had laughed. The camera caught her clearly, smirking as the pool filled with cement. Derek exhaled slowly. He had enough evidence for criminal charges, but just as he was about to close the laptop, something caught his eye. A second camera angle, a shot of his driveway. He rewound the footage, paused. His heart stopped. Karen, standing by his car. She was not just looking at it. She was doing something. Derek zoomed in, adjusting the brightness. His gut turned to ice. Karen was bent over, tampering with his brake lines. He pressed play. He watched as she stood up, wiped her hands, and walked away with a satisfied smirk. This was no longer about a racist act of vandalism. This was attempted murder, and Karen Whitmore had no idea what was coming next. The next morning, Derek walked into the local police department, his badge pinned proudly to his chest. The air was thick with the scent of stale coffee and paperwork, the usual buzz of officers going about their routine filling the space. But the moment he stepped into the station, conversations stuttered to a halt. A few officers glanced up from their desks, their expressions shifting from indifference to realization. Recognition dawned like a slow, creeping shadow. This was their new boss. The same man they had brushed off yesterday. Without a word, Derek made his way to the briefing room, his steps measured, his presence commanding. He did not need to raise his voice. He owned the room the moment he entered it. The officers, many of whom had dismissed his report the day before, were already seated, flipping through their morning assignments, still oblivious to what was about to happen. Then, Derek dropped the USB drive on the table. The sound echoed through the silent room. Slowly, he surveyed the faces before him, his dark eyes sharp as steel. "You all know me now," he said, his voice calm but unshakable. "And I know some of you." A few officers shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Others sat up straighter, realizing they were no longer in control of the conversation. "Yesterday, I filed a police report about a crime," Derek continued, "and some of you thought it was not worth pursuing." His gaze landed on the officer who had warned him about Karen's connections. The man swallowed hard. Derek pressed a button on the laptop connected to the projector. The screen flickered to life. Footage played. Karen Whitmore, the construction crew, the cement mixer. Derek's voice was steady as he narrated. This was not just an act of vandalism. It was premeditated. She gave orders. She orchestrated the whole thing, and she made sure to laugh while doing it. A few officers exchanged uneasy glances. The reality of the situation was sinking in. But Derek was not done. He clicked again. A new angle. Karen. By his car. The room went dead silent. Derek zoomed in on the footage, enhancing the image. Karen's hands working on the brake lines. The breath in the room felt like it had been sucked out completely. "This," Derek said, his voice turning sharp, "is not just a racist attack." He looked up, locking eyes with each of them. "This is attempted murder." A heavy silence fell over the room. Some officers looked horrified. Others looked ashamed. Derek folded his arms. "So tell me, are we going to keep protecting her, or are we going to do our damn jobs?" The hesitation was gone now. Officers scrambled to grab files, make calls, prepare an arrest warrant. Karen Whitmore had no idea what was coming for her. The afternoon sun hung high in the sky, casting a shimmering glow over the pristine neighborhood. In her backyard, Karen Whitmore reclined on a lounge chair beside her luxurious swimming pool, the one Derek was never supposed to have. A tall glass of lemonade rested beside her, condensation pooling at the base as she sipped, savoring the quiet satisfaction of a job well done. She had sent a message. Derek Lawson and his family did not belong here. With a smug smirk, She tilted her sunglasses down and let out a contented sigh, basking in the illusion of her untouchable reign. But that illusion was about to shatter. A distant siren wailed, one, then two, then a full chorus of police cars flooding the street. Karen sat up abruptly, her relaxation shattered by the overwhelming sight of blue and red flashing lights bouncing off her pristine white home. She blinked, confused, until she saw the swarm of officers stepping out of their cars, their expressions cold and focused. Panic shot through her chest like ice water. She stumbled to her feet, gripping the armrest of her chair. "What in the—" The officers strode forward. One of them, a sergeant, pulled out a folded document. His voice rang out, clear and authoritative. "Karen Whitmore, you are under arrest for property destruction and attempted homicide." The words hit her like a slap to the face. Her mouth opened and closed, her mind struggling to process the weight of what was happening. This is ridiculous," she screeched, her voice rising in pitch. "I am calling the mayor. He will clear this up." She reached for her phone, her fingers trembling, clinging to the last shred of power she thought she had. But before she could dial, a new voice cut through the commotion. A voice she never expected to hear. "The mayor works for me." Karen's head snapped up. Derek Lawson stepped forward, his badge gleaming under the sun, the symbol of his authority undeniable. Karen's entire world tilted on its axis, her face drained of color, her confident sneer melting into pure, unfiltered terror. Derek watched as the realization hit her like a freight train. The man she had spent weeks tormenting, the man she thought she had crushed under her boot, was not just another black homeowner she could bully. He was the chief of police. Her lips quivered. I did not. This is a mistake," she stammered, backpedaling. "I did not mean—" Derek's expression did not change. His voice was calm, deadly calm. "You meant every word," he said. "You meant every action." Karen shook her head furiously. No, you do not understand. I was just—" But the officers were already on her, yanking her hands behind her back. The cold bite of handcuffs snapped around her wrists. Tears welled in her eyes as panic overtook her. Wait, this cannot be happening." She turned desperately to the officers, searching for any sign of leniency, but found none. Her cries of protest were drowned out by the click of the cuffs locking into place. Karen Whitmore, the woman who had spent her life untouchable, privileged, and protected by her connections, was now being led away in disgrace. As they escorted her to the police car, the entire neighborhood watched. Some whispered, some gasped, some even smiled. For once, justice had not bent to power, and as Karen disappeared into the back of the squad car, Derek turned to walk away, his job here done. But before he left, he glanced at the hardened cement in his backyard, a monument to Karen's downfall. Then, without another word, he walked into his house, where his wife and daughter waited. Justice had been served, and Karen Whitmore had finally learned. Actions have consequences. The streets were eerily quiet as Karen Whitmore was led toward the waiting police car. The once pristine image of the neighborhood's self-proclaimed queen was now reduced to nothing more than a trembling, disgraced criminal. The sound of her expensive heels scuffing against the pavement filled the air, punctuated by her frantic pleas. "Please, you do not understand. This is a mistake." But no one was coming to her rescue. The neighbors, many of whom had once been under her thumb, stood on their porches, watching in stunned silence. Some whispered amongst themselves, their eyes flickering between Karen and Derek. Others stood with quiet satisfaction, seeing justice finally take a stand where privilege once ruled. As the police car door slammed shut, Karen's eyes darted wildly through the tinted glass, searching for an ally. There were none. For the first time in her life, Karen Whitmore was truly alone. Later that evening, the town hall was packed. Every seat was filled, and dozens more people stood along the walls, eager to witness what came next. The weight of what had transpired loomed over the gathering, the tension palpable. At the front of the room, Derek Lawson stood behind the podium, his gaze sweeping over the crowd. He saw doubt in some eyes, hope in others, and a burning curiosity in many. The microphone hummed as he leaned forward, his voice steady, unwavering. No one is above the law. The words hung in the air, heavy and undeniable. Not in this neighborhood, not anywhere. A murmur rippled through the crowd. A few heads nodded. Then came the first clap, another and another. Within seconds, the applause became thunderous. It was not just about Karen Whitmore. It was about all the years people like her had gotten away with things like this. The unchecked power, the privilege, the silent fear that had gripped this community for too long. It had finally been challenged, and justice had won. Derek let the applause settle before continuing. I did not move my family here to be made to feel like outsiders. We belong here just as much as anyone else. And I want every person in this town to understand, racism, intimidation, and criminal behavior will never be tolerated, not under my watch. He did not need to say Karen's name. Everyone knew. And as he stepped away from the podium, the crowd erupted again, not in hesitation this time, but in full resounding support. For the first time since moving here, Derek felt something shift. This was not just his home now. This was a place where change was possible. Later that night, Derek pulled into his driveway, the house bathed in the soft glow of the porch light. He sat there for a moment, staring at the cement-filled pool that had started it all. Karen had thought it would send a message. Instead, it became a monument to her downfall. He stepped out of the car, and before he could reach the door, it swung open. Aisha stood there, her expression unreadable, their daughter Zoe peeking from behind her. "Is it over?" she asked softly. Derek looked past her, into the warmth of their home. For weeks, this house had felt like a battleground, a place where they had to constantly prove themselves. But now it finally felt like theirs. He met his wife's gaze and nodded. It is just beginning. And for the first time in a long time, he smiled.